Well, welcome back, class. In our last lecture, we talked about the rise of Moses. We looked at the call of Moses in the wilderness of Sinai at the base of Mount Sinai. And in this session, we're going to look at the actual Exodus event. So let's jump in. Got a lot to cover. So Moses went back to Egypt after 40 years, being a wanted murderer, and confronted the Pharaoh. Again, we don't know who the Pharaoh was at this point, but Moses confronts him, and it sets up for this epic battle between the God of Israel and the God of the Egyptians, the Pharaoh. Well, when they first meet, the Pharaoh is less than excited about the idea of letting his pool of free labor go. The Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord?" Who is Yahweh there? "That I should obey him and let Israel go. I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go." And so this sets up for some of the most interesting reading in the Old Testament, the account of the 10 plagues. And there's a pattern here, beginning with Moses demanding that the people be let go on behalf of God, a threat of a plague if Pharaoh does not let them go, and then the reaction of Pharaoh. So, the first 9 plagues, and you can see they get progressively worse here. It starts with the water of the Nile, but not just the Nile, also the water all throughout Egypt in containers and jars and jugs being turned into blood. Then the plague of the frogs, which once the frogs die, I like the way the King James Version says, the land stinketh because of all the frogs. After that, flying bugs, gnats, come in. Then the second group of 3 are biting flies, like horse flies. Then there is a disease that strikes the cattle, and all of the cattle die. And then there are boils that are both on the remaining cattle that are alive and people as well. I decided to choose a tapestry for the picture of the boils rather than an actual picture of boils, just because they're pretty gross. And the last 3 are in succession: hail, locusts, and then darkness. Now, it's helpful to think of the first 9 plagues in 3 groups of 3. And when you think about it, the first triad, the first 3, they're all repulsive, but they're not necessarily harmful. I mean, I guess drinking water that was blood would be harmful if you drank it, but frogs and flying bugs, just kind of disgusting, not necessarily harmful. The second 3, however, all involve physical pain, whether it's the biting of the horse flies, the boils that are painful on both cattle and people. And the third triad are all natural disasters: hail, locusts, and darkness. So you can see here that they get worse as they go forward. And you think, well, certainly at some point Pharaoh's going to learn his lesson and he's going to let the people go. But he doesn't. And it comes at great cost. Well, Exodus is very clear about why these plagues were sent on Egypt. The first one, very practically, is to convince the Pharaoh to release the people from bondage. If he had done that, then the plagues would have stopped. It's also to make both the Egyptians and the Israelites respect who the God of Israel is, who Yahweh is. And when the Israelites finally leave, there are a lot of Egyptians that go with them. After suffering through all these plagues, they think to themselves, why would I stay here? The third reason is to create respect for Moses. Remember, one of the things that God promised Moses is that he would be with him, that he would not leave him on his own. And so the fact that God sends these plagues at the command of Moses shows that God has got Moses' back, so to speak. A fourth reason that I find incredibly fascinating can be found in Exodus 12:12, when God says, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. And so we see that there are also specific attacks on specific Egyptian deities that the Egyptians had created, believing that they were really gods, but of course they weren't really gods. So the plague of the frogs is an attack on the Egyptian deity Hecate, the frog god. The water to blood is an attack on Isis, the goddess of the Nile. The last plague of darkness is an attack on the greatest of all the Egyptian gods, the sun god, Ra. So it's fascinating to contemplate the idea that God is saying that these deities that you have created and you worship, they're really not gods at all. Well, some have suggested that really the plagues are just a series of cataclysmic events that cascade. That the water in the Nile turned to blood, that drives all the frogs out. The frogs get away from the water, they die. When they die, that allows the flying bugs and the biting bugs to come. They bite the cattle die. I mean, I guess you could argue that. But there are a couple of problems with that. Number one is that they start and stop at the command of Moses. So it's not as if it's just a bunch of dominoes falling. The other thing is that the plagues don't affect everyone in Egypt. Several of the plagues only affect the Egyptians and not the Israelites. So that's a little difficult to explain. Then there was the promise of the 10th plague, which would be the worst of all. Here in Exodus 10:23, yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. So the idea that this is just a cascading effect doesn't really work. Well, the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And here, God commands both Israelites and Egyptians to put blood on the door frames of their houses in a profession of faith that as the angel of death passed through the land of Egypt, that the angel would pass over the houses of those who had blood on the door frames. So those who do not will experience the death of their firstborn child. And so, in some chilling verses in Exodus 12:29 and 30, it says that there was not a house in all of Egypt where there was not a dead body, as the angel of the Lord went through the land and killed the firstborn. Well, this is enough for Pharaoh. After the 10th plague, including his own son that is killed in the death of the firstborn, he tells them that it's time for them to go. Ultimately, there were 3 ceremonies, 3 holidays that came out of the 10th plague. Passover, which is the most important holiday, celebrated every spring by the Jews. The festival of unleavened bread, because they didn't have time for the bread to rise because they had to leave so quickly. And the dedication of the firstborn, those of which were spared by placing blood over the doorframe. So Israel packs its things and they leave Egypt quickly. Well, no sooner do they leave Egypt do they come into contact with what is called the Yam Suf. This in Hebrew is the Sea of Reeds. Now eventually this got anglicized into the Red Sea, But technically, it's not called the Red Sea, it's called the Sea of Reeds. And as we'll look in a second at a map, we're not exactly sure where this was, where the crossing of the sea was. What we do know is that the waters were divided and the Israelites went through on dry ground with a wall of water on the right and a wall on their left. Now, how big was this wall? Don't really know. That's all the detail that we have. But it was big enough to drown the entire Egyptian army as they tried to chase Israel back through. Well, as we'll see in just a moment, God protected the Israelites by sending them the harder way down into the Sinai Peninsula instead of the fastest way to get to the promised land of Canaan. He did this because the Egyptians would have had outposts all along the quick path to Canaan. Plus, God also had a promise to keep to Moses when he told Moses, "You will bring them back to this mountain and you will worship me here." Joseph's bones are taken. If you remember at the end of Genesis, he made them promise after he died that they would take his bones with them back to Canaan. God gave them guidance with a cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. But as we read in chapter 14, Pharaoh changed his mind. He tries to chase them. The Egyptian army goes into the sea, but they never come out. The waters recede, and the entire army is drowned because of Pharaoh and his stubbornness. Well, here is a map, and granted, there's a lot of different lines on here. There's really three possible routes that are discussed. One is the quickest way, as I just mentioned before. This is clearly not how they went, especially with the traditional location of Mount Sinai down here in the lower Sinai Peninsula. Others have suggested that Mount Sinai is actually over here in what is today Saudi Arabia, that they would have crossed the sea somewhere up here, but that they would have come across and down here. The traditional model, however, is that the Yam Suf is somewhere up here, that they would have come down into the Sinai Peninsula. The traditional location for Mount Sinai is in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and that is where they would have had their encounter with God. I tend to hold to the traditional path, with the Yam Suf being somewhere up here in the north, and then Mount Sinai being in the southern Sinai Peninsula. Well, let's talk about as they are traveling. When we get to the book of Numbers, we'll talk about the large possibility of numbers that they were in the Israelite crowd. Regardless, they still would have needed a lot of water, and they run out after just a few days, and they begin complaining. God, however, provides them water. They also run out of food, and God provides them with manna and quail. We're not exactly sure what manna is, neither were the Israelites. That's why they called it manna. In Hebrew, manna means, what is it? Ma-na. We're not exactly sure what it is. Some kind of bread, perhaps, that sustained them regardless. God also provides them with a key military victory. They're attacked by a marauding tribe called the Amalekites. We're introduced to Joshua for the first time as he leads them in the battle. And Moses goes up on the hill and prays over the people as they fight the Amalekites down in the valley. Well, this brings us to the second major section of the book of Exodus, which takes place at the base of Mount Sinai and covers the covenant at Mount Sinai. Now, it's taken them 3 months since they left Egypt and crossed the Yam Suf, and they have come to the place where Moses had his first encounter with God, Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. Now, it's important to remember that God has already chosen Israel to be his people. His grace toward them is evident in the fact that he has already brought them out of Egypt, and he's chosen them, and he's said that he's chosen them. He chose them before they ever even existed in the promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, before the covenant is actually given at Mount Sinai, God lays out the stipulations. And for the people, it is simple obedience. They must obey whatever God says in the covenant. And if they do, God promised a unique relationship with him. They would be his treasured possession. They would be a kingdom of priests and a holy, separate, different nation. God would have a relationship with them that he would share with no other people group on the planet. Well, Moses went up onto Mount Sinai, met with God, and brings back the law. And the purpose of the law is to maintain community among each other as they maintain it in relationship with God. They have to be right with each other in order to be right with God. And they have to be right with God in order to be right with each other. Now, we'll talk much more about Old Testament law and the categories of it, but here we begin to see it here in Exodus. I mean, parts of the law are stated in universal terms, such as the Decalogue or the 10 words of the 10 commandments. These are stated in terms of, you shall never do these things, ever, under any circumstances. But then you get into culture-specific laws, laws about diet, laws about cleanliness, personal hygiene, civil laws, things like that. Now, we'll talk much more about this when we get to Leviticus, but just know now that there are two categories that are generally agreed upon: the universal law, and then laws that were specifically for Israel in their cultural setting. Now, of course, Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 called on individuals to look at the original intention of the law, to look at the spirit of the law, not just the letter. And that his intention was not to abolish it, but to bring to it its fullest meaning, or to fulfill it. We'll come back to this when we get to Leviticus. Well, as I mentioned, the Decalogue is stated in universal terms. In other words, don't ever do these things, ever. This is what's known as apodictic law. Then there's casuistic law, which is case law. If this happens, then do this. And then we also have in Exodus a brief collection of law codes, criminal, civil, ritual laws that are fully expressed when we get to Leviticus. So, the laws given by God to Moses. Moses gives it to the people. Sacrifices are made. Blood is sprinkled on the people. A meal is eaten. And then the glory of God comes and rests on the mountain there in Israel. In Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. This is the manifestation of God and his blessing coming and dwelling on the mountain. That Hebrew word for rested or dwelled is the word shakan. It's where we get our idea of Shekinah, the dwelling or resting glory of God. Pretty amazing stuff to think about what Israel experienced there at the base of Mount Sinai. Well, the last major section of Exodus has to do with the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle was intended to be a mobile worship facility. And God gives the instructions, the dimensions, and in 25 to 31, and then the rest of Exodus is the construction of the tabernacle. Now, this is a bird's eye view of what the tabernacle would have looked like, as a diagram, and then we'll back up and take a different look at it here. So the dimensions of a curtain that went all the way around, the curtain was 7.5 feet high, so you couldn't see over it. It was 150 feet long and 75 feet wide. So it was a big rectangle. The tabernacle itself was this building on the inside of the curtain. All the rest was an open courtyard area. Now, in the open courtyard, there were two items, a bronze basin and an altar of burnt offering. The most important piece was the altar of burnt offering. This is where the sacrifices of animals would take place. We'll talk a lot more about this when we get to Leviticus, about those sacrifices. And then the bronze basin was used to wash the blood off of the hands of the worshiper. The tabernacle itself was a small building, 45 feet long and 15 feet wide. It was made of animal skins. It was enclosed. And there were two places, or two rooms in the tabernacle. One was 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. The other was 15 feet square. Only priests were allowed to go inside the tabernacle building. Anyone could be in the open courtyard, but only priests could go into the tabernacle. The first room was the holy place. Inside the holy place, there were three items. The table of the bread of presence, which had a grain offering that was constantly there to provide food for the priests, but also as a grain offering to the Lord. A menorah, or a candelabra, that would provide light inside, simply because it was enclosed. And an altar of incense, where there was constant fragrant offerings burning to the Lord. Inside the Holy of Holies was the most important piece of equipment, I guess you could say, in the tabernacle. That was the Ark of the Covenant. This was a box that was overlaid with gold, with two cherubs on top with their wings touching. And this symbolized the very presence of God himself. Now, only priests could go into the holy place, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. And he could only do that one day a year. That was on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. We'll talk more about all of these pieces and how they were used a little bit later. But they're introduced here. So here we've got the altar of burnt offering, which was, in a sense, a big barbecue pit. It would have had a grate over the top. The animal would have been sacrificed, blood sprinkled all around, and depending on the type of sacrifice, the animal would be burned there on the altar of burnt offering. Then there was the bronze basin. This is where the worshiper would wash himself off after the sacrifice. Inside the holy place, the altar of incense is where there would be a constant fragrant offering being burned. The table of bread is where the grain offering to God for his sustenance and thankfulness. But it was also where the priests would eat. That's how the priests survived, because they didn't have land or fields up for themselves. The menorah would also be in the holy place, lit to give light to the room. And then there was the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies. The area up on top where the angels or the cherubs' wings touched was called the mercy seat. It's where the very presence of God was said to dwell. Now, interesting, in the New Testament, the word that's used to describe the mercy seat is hilasterion. And In 1 John 2 and 1 John 4 and Romans 3, Jesus is described as the mercy seat. He is the place where heaven and earth meet. Now, the tabernacle as a whole, and here's kind of a view from a distance, this was the place where Israel would worship God and atone for their sin. In the southern part of the nation of Israel today, there is a full-scale mock-up of what the tabernacle looked like. And all of these pictures are from that, that particular place. So you can see, here's the tabernacle itself, enclosed, animal skins over the top. There's the curtain that went around it. You can't really see it, but in the open courtyard, that's where the altar of burnt offering, the bronze basin were. The tabernacle as a whole showed that God is holy, that there has to be preparation before you go into his presence, that you don't just go merrily skipping along, but there is thought that goes into that. And you have to be holy to come into his presence to begin with. It also shows that he is accessible, that he's not far off. He's able to be reached by humanity. And then third, that he is mobile as well. Many ancient Near Eastern religions believed that their God was limited to and lived inside a temple, that the God could not leave that temple. Or if the God could leave the temple, couldn't go beyond the perimeter of that nation's geographic boundaries. Well, that is not what we see with Yahweh, the God of Israel. I mean, he is just as mobile as the tabernacle is. He is not bound by time or by space or by geography. So ultimately, here's what a little diorama of the tabernacle would have looked like. You see the curtain around, you see the altar of burnt offering, the bronze basin. In here, part of that would be the holy place, the front part. The back part would be the Holy of Holies, that only the high priest could go in once a year. Now, the most of the latter half of the book of Exodus is all about the construction of the tabernacle. Because again, the details are very, very minute. God tells them exactly how to build this in 25 through 31, and then the rest of it is the tabernacle actually being built. So the instructions are very detailed. God has a specific way that he wants his people to worship him. And it's a statement and it's a reminder of the importance and the holiness of God's presence, that he is the one who determines how human beings come into his presence. It's not us. He's the one who makes the rules. And Israel would have to abide by those if they wanted to encounter Yahweh, their God. Okay, well, again, a lot of material, and we covered a lot. You've got plenty to read and research. If any of this is interesting to you, please feel free to investigate it further. This is just a jump-off point for you. And I hope that something here spurred your interest and that you will dive in, because there is a lot in the book of Exodus to be able to digest. Well, next week we will be covering the also important book of Leviticus. I hope that you have a great week, and I look forward to meeting with you then. Have a great day.